most welcome. And with that, we go to the gentlelady from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Frazier, I'd like to return to you. I appreciate so much your discussion of the Commerce Clause, and I think you made some important distinctions for us already in your testimony when you talked about the need for the federal government to intervene and think about preemption when we're talking about a subject that affects the economic or political stability of the United States. And you drew a distinction between pigsties and artificial intelligence. Would you elaborate for us, please, about why you believe the things that we're discussing here today do go to the heart of the economic and political stability of the United States and should be distinct from those areas where the laboratories of democracy concept actually works?
Thank you for the question, Representative Lee. I think it's profoundly important to get back to that Brandeis quote about laboratories of democracy. There's a forgotten portion of that quote, which is without risk to the nation. You can run an experiment without risk to the nation. Many of these experiments that we're seeing proposed and enacted in California do pose a risk to the nation because they try to impede AI innovation itself. When we see individual states reach into the AI development process, they're not just tinkering with a modular process. There's not a AI-specific training run for California that OpenAI does. Anthropic doesn't train its models 50 times over for each state. So while there may be a lane for state regulation, and I believe there's a lane for state regulation with respect to AI use, we have to follow up and ask the question of what does a real experiment look like? And that experiment can't be one that exceeds the borders of that state. And yet California's bills time and time again would result in labs having to change their practices the nation over. And I've lived in California, I've lived in Florida, I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Oregon, I've lived in Massachusetts and in DC. And I can tell you in each of those places, they don't want Californians dictating the terms of their AI.
And I also need to follow up on this question. You said something interesting when you were talking about current copyright law, how it operates in really ensuring that we are still honoring the concepts of content creators and intellectual property. You suggested an economic analysis of what's happening with the use of this content and training models. Would you elaborate for us a bit more on how that would look and how we can get to the bottom of how to properly compensate those content creators?
Happily, thank you for the question. If you look at current settlements, for example, in the Bartz v. Anthropic decision, and you begin to analyze who may those funds actually go toward, a large number of that fee is going to go to publishers. It's not going to go to the actual authors themselves. So if we are trying to incentivize the creation of new art and new discoveries and new scientific discoveries, copyright may not be the vehicle we need. It's not serving the same purpose it did in 1789, back when it was just limited to 14 years with the possibility of a 14-year renewal. It is now 70 years plus the life of the author. That is an incredibly long time, especially when you consider that the founders really hated monopolies. So the fact that we've ended up in a world in which a handful of publishers may be able to dictate the quality of our AI, I think is antithetical to the original purpose of the IP clause.
Thank you. And Mr. Thayer, one of the things that you touched on was the idea that Congress could explore giving NIST or CASI more authority to develop standards for AI frontier models. Would you share more on your perspective of how we might do that? Should we designate a single federal entity to try to develop those standards? Share with us a little more on your thoughts there, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Let's be clear that the reason that NIST needs to play a role here in this new CASI body is because they have the ability to address exactly what the problem is here, which is that many states are attempting to impose a very technocratic type of design on artificial intelligence models and systems preemptively in an almost European-style way. And that's a huge problem. I'll just again quote from Governor Jared Polis, who said, "Government regulation that is applied at the state level in a patchwork across the country can have the effect to tamper innovation and deter competition in an open market." But it's not just that. These states lack the technical capability to do some of this in certain circumstances, and they lack the information needed to do it properly. We have set up this body, I should remind the committee, set up under President Biden and retained by President Trump. and a bipartisan move, and just renamed to focus more on standards and innovation. That's a good plan. Once again, we have a bipartisan agreement here. We've got a new technical body, and it can handle it in conjunction with other existing policies, both federal and state.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you.